All right, hi guys. So in this video, we are going to go through some of the muscles that you need to know for lecture. And we're going to do most of it. This is kind of like the chapter we did on bones. A lot of this is going to need to be you independently studying the muscles and really looking at them and how they're connected to the bones and what movements they produce. So we're going to go over them. But to really have a strong understanding of the muscles, you're going to need to practice them. And you'll need this for lab as well. So you need to practice, and you can use pictures from your textbook and your lab manual. There are also a lot of free apps that you can get for your computer or websites or your phone, or if you have a tablet, that sort of thing. But we're going to go through each of the muscles, and I'll point out where they are and talk about a couple things relating to them. But this is going to be a lot of you having to review and study these muscles, okay, to become familiar with them. All right. And so the first thing we're going to do actually is define a couple of things. So with muscles, we talk about their origin and their insertions. So this just is where that they attach to the bones. Okay. So the origin is going to be the less mobile point. Right, so it's less movable. It's kind of the stationary point where the muscle attaches. All right. And the insertion is generally more movable. And typically it's going to move towards the insertion when the muscle contracts. All right. So it moves towards the origin. All right, so it moves towards origin. Okay, so that's during muscle contraction. And so with lecture, I'm not going to have you memorizing the origins and insertions for any of the specific muscles. That's not really important for lecture. That's something you'll do in lab, likely for your lab exam. But I would recommend looking at the origins and insertions, and I'll post a chart kind of the muscles, and the movements they produce and their origins and insertions and that sort of thing. And you can use the origins and insertions to kind of make sense of the movements that muscles produce. So you don't have to tell me any origins and insertions, but they might help you when you're studying. All right. And so one thing with muscles to keep in mind is what happens when a muscle contracts. Okay. So when a muscle contracts, it is going to get shorter. Okay, so when muscles contract, they're going to shorten. All right, and that's the one thing that I want you to always keep in mind. So when a muscle contracts, it gets shorter. So when you're looking at a muscle, say what would happen if this muscle got shorter? What movement would that produce? Okay, and so when it shortens, it's going to pull the insertion towards the origin. All right. Okay. And so what we're going to do first for this chapter is we are going to go through just kind of the muscles based on where they're located. Okay. So we're going to start with facial muscles. Facial muscles are a little special because they typically are involved in producing, aside from your chewing muscles, right? They're involved in producing facial expressions. All right, and so they insert into the skin, right? Those that are involved in facial expression insert into the skin. Okay, and so let's go through a few of them. So most of the muscles we're going to go over are going to be in an app. We'll look at them in kind of in 3D. However, I feel like these muscles on the face are easier to visualize on these graphics that come from your textbook. Okay, so let's go through the facial muscles. They are controlled, by the way, by the facial nerve. All right, so one of the cranial nerves you'll be learning when we do our nervous system chapter. Okay, so let's go through some of these and we can talk about kind of the facial expression that they control for each of them. Okay, So the first one, we have two muscles that go by the name orbicularis. All right, and I'll write these on the app. The names will pop up when we look at them, but I'll write these up here. All right, so orbicularis. So we have the orbicularis oris, and we have the orbicularis oculi. Okay, so orbicularis just refers to the fact that the muscle has kind of a circular, right, orbit, kind of circular shape. All right, so orbicularis oris is going to be the muscle that goes around the mouth. So it actually creates a circle like this, all right, around the mouth. So that would allow you to make sort of a like whistling or kissing kind of motion with your mouth when it contracts. Okay, and then the orbicularis oculi is going to go around the eye. So it's this muscle that circles the eye. So when that contracts, it'll allow you to wink or blink or, close your eye. Okay, so those are our first two. And then we have the buccinator or buccinator muscle. All right, so buccinator. And that's actually going to be a kind of internal muscle. All right, you can see it on this picture. Let's see. It would be kind of in here, like behind here, right? So it's internal because it's kind of on the, like, if you go from the inside of your mouth, right, it's the muscles you can touch kind of with your tongue on your cheek. It's that muscle, all right? And so it's essentially your cheek muscle. So it allows you to compress your cheeks, right? And so this would be for like whistling and that sort of thing. Or sucking on a straw, you would use this muscle, all right? When you chew, it helps to push food back into your teeth, right? So from your cheeks, it moves food between your teeth as well. Okay, and then we have the zygomatic muscle. All right, so the zygomatic muscle, hopefully you're thinking, just based on what you know about the bones now, all right, that it must relate in some way to the zygomatic bone, which it does, all right? So you have a zygomatic major and a zygomatic minor. Again, similar to the bones, I'm not going to put any pictures like this on the exam, so you don't need to point out to me where the zygomatic major or minor are. You just need to know what these muscles do in general, their functions. So this would be the zygomatic major muscle. So it goes from the zygomatic bone up here, all right, to kind of the corner of the lip. So this would be the origin, all right, and it actually would insert into the skin, all right. And so it's responsible, this is the smiling muscle. Okay, all right, so it would pull up on the corners of the mouth. So if this muscle, that's what you ask yourself when you're looking at a muscle like this, right? So if this muscle got shorter, this is the origin, all right? It's going to pull the insertion towards it this way. That would pull up the corners of the mouth, causing a smile, okay? All right. So those are the facial muscles I want you guys to know. And just for reference, these are going to be in your chapter review. So any muscles that are bolded in your chapter 10 review are muscles that you need to be familiar with. So you need to know their function and the movements that they produce. Okay. And there's lots of questions to kind of help you practice that in your chapter review. All right. So then our other head and neck muscles, right, are going to be the sternocleidomastoid. So this is the muscle. So this name of the muscle actually tells you where it's attached. So its origin and location, or origin and insertion. And so the sternocleidomastoid attaches to the sternum, right? And the clavicle, that's cleido. So the sternum and the clavicle. And then it goes to the mastoid process on the skull. All right, so it's going to attach here. All right, so both of these parts are sternocleidomastoid. So it's to the sternum and the clavicle, and then it goes up to that mastoid process that's almost like right behind your ear, right? You can actually kind of touch it with your finger. It's a little bump right behind your ear, okay? And so this muscle, what it does, and you'd have one on each side, so you'd have another one over here. Okay, and so when this contracts, it's going to be pulling your head downward. All right, so origin, insertion. All right, so it's going to pull your head downward. So if both the left and the right sternocleidomastoid contract together, that would cause flexion of your neck, right? Moving your chin downwards towards your chest. Okay, so that's if they both contract. If only one contracts, right, maybe this one only contracts, that actually is going to rotate your head slightly, right? So it rotates towards the opposite side of where the muscle is. Okay, and so then this muscle, if it contracts, would rotate the head this way. Okay, so sternocleidomastoid, neck flexion if they both contract, rotation if only one contracts. All right, and then also controlling movement of the neck is the trapezius muscle. All right, so that's this big muscle here. All right, and then you would have a second one kind of mirroring that on the other side like this. Okay, that's the trapezius muscle. And so as it relates to neck movement, when this contracts, right, it pulls downward, that's going to pull the head backwards. So bring your chin up, okay? And so that would be hyperextending or extending the neck, right? So this would be neck extension / hyperextension. All right, so hopefully you're seeing how you can kind of, whoops, pen's getting out of control. There we go, hyperextension. So hopefully you're seeing how you can look at these muscles, where they're attached, and you can say, if this muscle shortens, what movement is that going to produce? All right, and so you can figure out that movement. Okay, and so one of the reasons you're learning these two muscles is because they are antagonistic to each other. All right, so sternocleidomastoid produces neck flexion, all right, and the trapezius produces neck extension. All right, so this just means that they produce opposite movements. All right, they're working against each other. Okay, so when the sternocleidomastoid is contracting, causing neck flexion, the trapezius muscle would need to be relaxed in order for the neck to actually flex. Okay, you can also have muscles that are synergistic. All right, that just means that they have the same function. All right, they're working to do the same thing. So you have a lot of muscles that kind of work together. So those would be synergistic muscles. All right. Okay. So let's move over to the abs. So we have our different groups of muscles we're going to go through. So arm and shoulder, trunk muscles. We'll look at the diaphragm and then the hip and leg muscles. Okay, so let's switch over, all right, to this app and look at these different muscles. Okay, so let's start with our kind of shoulder and arm muscles. All right, so our first one, and if you look kind of in the top right, you can see when I click on like a muscle, all right, choose a muscle, it'll tell you what that muscle is. So if while we're going through this, you're wondering how something is spelled, it's going to be in your chapter review, but it's also up in the top right corner when I have that muscle selected. Okay, so that way, because I can't really write on this app like I can on the other app, so you can see the names of the muscles there. Okay, so our first muscle is the pectoralis major. So that's your big pec muscle, all right? And so you have different parts of it. So you have, they have different, they're divided into different sections. We're just learning the whole muscle. So it's this big kind of pec muscle. It has the two parts, and it is involved in flexing, all right? So if you can kind of imagine this muscle, all right, is going to flex the shoulder. So if it contracts, that would bring your arm forward, right? So that would be muscle flexion. Okay. It would also adduct the arm, all right, at the shoulder. So it would bring your arm towards your trunk, and it would rotate the arm medially. Okay. Okay, and so with the pectoralis muscle, one thing I really like about this app, and I keep learning more things the more I use it, all right, is that you can isolate and look at just this muscle and where it's attached. I'm sure a lot of other apps do this too. All right, so I can just click on this one button. Now I can see that, look, this is attached medially to the sternum, and it's attached kind of to the anterior aspect of the humerus. And so now that makes sense why it would rotate, right, the shoulder, right, when it contracts, and it would adduct the arm, as well as causing flexion. So it's attaching to the front of the humerus, so it would pull that humerus forward, okay? So you could do that for the different muscles. All right, and so now our next muscle is the latissimus dorsi. So your lat muscles, your lats. So let's go to the back. All right, so this would be the latissimus dorsi here. Okay, and so the latissimus dorsi is going to function in moving the shoulder. So it is going to extend the shoulder. This is an antagonist to that pectoralis we just looked at. So if we kind of do this, zoom out a little bit, whoops, like this. Okay, and so you can see it attaches to the vertebral column medially and then to the humerus laterally. Okay, so it's going to extend the humerus, pull it backwards. All right, it's also going to adduct the shoulder, and so then it also will medially rotate because it kind of attaches on the front of the humerus, so it will medially rotate the humerus as well. Okay, so it's an antagonist to the pectoralis we just looked at, in that it causes extension and the pectoralis major causes flexion. However, it's also a synergist to other functions. So both the pectoralis major and the latissimus dorsi cause adduction, and they both cause medial rotation. Okay? All right. So that's the latissimus dorsi. So let's go back. All right. Because also you have another kind of set, like another muscle here. All right. This is the teres major. Okay. So the teres major has all of those same functions that we just talked about with our latissimus dorsi, right? So it works, if we kind of isolate it, right, very similarly to that, right? It's just attached, it's much smaller, it's attached to the scapula instead of the spinal column, but it does many of the same movements. Okay, so that's the teres major. All right, now let's talk about the rotator cuff muscles. Okay, so these rotator cuff muscles are going to help to stabilize that shoulder as well as producing some movement. Okay, but their big important function is to stabilize the shoulder. Okay, so let's look at these different ones. So you have our supraspinatus muscle, and so with these muscles, they are kind of named based on where they're located. So if a muscle is supraspinatus, you should probably learned in lab, right, with the scapula. You have the spine of the scapula, you have the supraspinous fossa, you have the infraspinous fossa. So this supraspinatus muscle, if we get rid of this trapezius, all right, let's hide that one. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to find this guy sitting right here in that supraspinous fossa. Okay, so that is the supraspinatus muscle. All right, you would find the infraspinatus here, sitting in that infraspinous fossa, all right, below the spine of the scapula. And then you would have, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Maybe, there we go. All right, the teres minor, the little tiny muscle here, and we just talked about the teres major here. Okay, so we have the teres minor sits right above it. And then we also have the subscapularis. So the subscapularis is going to be on the other side of the scapula. So it's going to be kind of facing the rib cage. So let's see if we can get to it. Let me try to clear out some of this stuff and see if we can find it. Okay. All right, so it took me a second, but I found it. All right, so it's hard to see, but it sits in that subscapular fossa, right? That part of the scapula that sits against the rib cage, so you can kind of see it back there. So those are the rotator cuffs. So we have the subscapularis, right? And I've kind of removed some of the other muscles here. We have the supraspinatus, if it'll select. There we go. All right, we have the infraspinatus. We have our teres minor here. Okay, so those are our rotator cuff muscles. Okay, so let's reset this guy. Put his muscles back. All right, and so then we have our deltoid muscle. Okay, so the deltoid, very important for movement at the shoulder. So we have part of our deltoid here. Let's just select the whole thing. Okay, so you can see it covers the entire shoulder. So anteriorly and posteriorly, it covers the shoulder. Okay, and so one of its major functions is shoulder abduction. All right, so moving the arm away from the trunk, right? So if you just pick up your arm straight out to the side, that shoulder abduction, you can see pretty easily just looking at this muscle that would be a pretty obvious function of it, right? So it contracts, it gets shorter, that's going to pull the arm away from the body, okay? All right, so with the other functions of this muscle, that actually comes into play because of the different locations of its three kind of different parts that we have here. So this deltoid muscle can both extend and flex the shoulder. So you have, all right, this part here, all right, that would pull the arm forward, so that would flex the shoulder. And you have this part here that would pull the arm backwards, that would extend the shoulder, okay? And this is just because we have different origins, okay? So we have three different origins we're looking at here, right? And they all insert into the same spot on the humerus down at the bottom, okay? So because we have different origins, we can produce different movements. Okay, so our next muscle is the biceps brachii, all right? So we have that here. So bi tells us it's going to have two different origins, all right? And so if we kind of select both parts, whoops, no, not what I wanted. No, that's just going to select too much. Okay, so you have this one part here and you have the other part here. They sit side by side. They make up the biceps of the arm, all right? And so you can see, okay, good, it's showing us both here. We have two origins up here at the scapula, all right? So that's for the biceps, all right? So the name tells you it has two origins. This muscle will function in the moving the shoulder and the elbow, all right? So this is the first time we've seen this with a muscle. So let's talk about that. So if a muscle spans, right, crosses two joints, it will produce movement at both of those joints. And so you can see that this biceps muscle goes across the shoulder joint, right, up there at the top. It goes from the scapula and crosses down the humerus, so it's crossing the shoulder joint. And it also crosses the elbow joint, all right, down there. So that means that the biceps brachii can produce movement at both the shoulder and the elbow. So at the elbow, it would cause flexion, all right, so it would bend the elbow. So we actually, I think, have an animation here. There we go. So we can see that biceps contracting and causing that elbow flexion, okay? And so what we can also see is underneath it, all right, that's our next muscle. That is the brachialis muscle. So it only spans the elbow joint. So it's only going to flex the elbow. Okay, so we have the biceps on top here, right, causing flexion of the elbow, also of the shoulder. And then we have the brachialis underneath that is just flexing the elbow. Okay, good. All right. So then our next muscle is the triceps brachii. So this would be the antagonist to our biceps. It's on the back of the arm. All right. It has three different heads, tri meaning three. All right. And so let's push that up. Whoops. Okay. So triceps, if we just isolate this guy, right? Now we've got all three of them here. So you can kind of see there's two on top and there's one kind of underneath them. Those are the three parts with three origins. You can see that this one part here, right, attaches from the scapula all the way down, right? And so it goes to where that little blue point is on the ulna. Okay, and so that means it spans just like the biceps, right? It spans the shoulder and the elbow. So it's going to produce movement at both. All right, so it's going to extend the elbow as well as the shoulder, right? So shoulder extension, elbow extension, opposite of the biceps. Okay, so biceps is on the front of the arm, causes flexion. Triceps is on the back of the arm, causes extension. Okay, good. All right, so those are our arm, no, I don't want to rate it. All right, so those are our arm muscles. So let's move on to the muscles of the trunk. Okay, so let's look at the abdominal muscles first. All right, so we have the abdominal muscles are kind of in layers. All right, so the outermost muscle here would be our external obliques. So obliques just means that the muscle fibers are running at an angle, right? So you can kind of see that how they're moving like downward from kind of, the sides laterally towards the middle. They run at an angle. That's the oblique part, all right? So those are our external obliques. If we remove that guy, underneath that we can see we have a set of muscles that go vertically. All right, that is the rectus abdominis. Rectus meaning it's going straight up and down. All right, and that's the abdominis. So you'd have those on both sides. Hide that. There we go. All right, so we have rectus abdominis here and here. And then just outside of that, all right, we have our internal obliques. Okay, so these are going to be kind of lateral to that rectus abdominis. Again, they're going at an angle. They're not straight horizontal. They're not straight up and down. They're at an angle, so they're called obliques. Okay, and so then if we remove that guy, all right, that guy, we can see the innermost muscle here is the transverse abdominis. So transverse meaning it's mostly going horizontal. All right, so the innermost abdominal muscle is the transverse abdominis. Okay, so those are our abdominal muscles. All right, so then our trunk muscles, those are on the front. Our trunk muscles on the back. All right, so if we remove kind of our, let's see, our latissimus dorsi muscles here. All right, our serratus muscles, these guys. Here we go. All right. So we have on our back, our big group of muscles are the erector spinae muscles. So they're kind of buried deep under a few layers of other muscles. All right. And they are going to cause, so they're going to work antagonistically to your abdominal muscles. So your abdominal muscles would contract and typically cause flexion of the spine, right? So you bending kind of forward versus the erector spinae would extend the spine or the trunk, all right? So you'd kind of lean backwards, okay? So those are the erector spinae muscles. All right. So now I'm going to take a second and find the diaphragm. I'm going to have to remove a few muscles to get in there. Okay. All right. So on this view, we can see the diaphragm, okay? So you have your rib cage, right? And you look inside of it. It's kind of this dome-shaped structure inside of your rib cage, okay? And so that's the division between your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity, right? And it's important for breathing. It's made of skeletal muscle, like all your other muscles we're talking about. And so when it contracts, it moves downward and it opens the lungs with that movement, okay? Okay, so now let's look at the leg muscles, all right? So if we look here, we're going to start with kind of a little more internal leg muscles on the anterior part of your hip, All right, so we have the iliacus and the psoas. Together, they make up the iliopsoas. All right, and so they attach from you can see your femur, right, up to your spine. So this would be the psoas. And then if we look at the iliacus, all right, here, you can see from the femur to the kind of iliac crest of your coxal bone, okay? And so they're going to cause movement at the hip, all right? Specifically, they're going to cause flexion of the hip, so bringing your thigh forward, all right? Okay, and so these are going to flex only at the hip, all right? So now let's move and talk about the quadriceps muscles. So these are the major thigh muscles on the front of your thigh, all right? And so there's 4, quad meaning 4, and so we have our, oops, here, right? We have the rectus femoris is in the middle. Lateral to that, we have the vastus lateralis, and then we have the vastus medius here, all right? And so then our 4th one is actually under the rectus femoris. So if we just hide that for a second, you'll see that here, right? This is the vastus intermedius. So you have the vastus medialis on the medial side of the thigh, intermedius is in the middle under that rectus femoris, and the lateralis is here on the lateral side of the thigh, okay? All right, so if we kind of pop that little quadriceps back in, and then we can look at where it's attached. All right, and so you can see that this quadriceps muscle spans from the coxal bone at the top, right, up here, and it goes all the way down, to the tibia, okay? So it spans the hip and the knee joint, all right? So that rectus femoris covers 2 joints, all right? And it causes movement at the hip and at the knee for that reason, all right? So it's gonna flex the hip, right? Move that hip forward, all right? And for the knee, it's gonna extend it, because remember with knee, flexion is moving that foot backwards, right? So that would be knee flexion. So then this muscle would cause knee extension and hip flexion. Okay, so those are the quadriceps muscles. All right, so then let's look kind of at some other additional muscles, and then we'll do the hamstrings. All right, so let's look at some other muscles that are on the front first while we're here. Okay, so we have this muscle here, that's the sartorius. All right, if we isolate it, that sartorius attaches to, you can see the coxal bone there on the top, right? And it goes all the way down to the tibia on the bottom. So again, this spans 2 joints, so it causes movement of the hip and the knee, okay? And then we have, let's see some of our other muscles. We have the gracilis. So the gracilis is on the inner part of the thigh. So we can select that here, okay? So gracilis also goes, again, from the hip, all right, the coxal bone, all the way down to the tibia, so that can move both the hip and the knee joint, all right? And then lastly, we have the tensor fascia latae, and so that's going to be on the lateral part of the thigh. So that would be this muscle here. And so this muscle, if we kind of isolate it here, you can see goes from the outside of that coxal bone all the way down to the outside of the tibia. So again, movement at the hip and the knee. Okay, so for those 3 muscles. All right, good. Then we have our gluteal muscles, all right, so the muscles of the buttocks. And so we have the gluteus maximus, all right. So this would be the gluteus maximus, the outer muscles. Let's isolate it so we can see where it's attaching, right? So it attaches from the coxal bone, you can see there, and it wraps around the femur here, okay? So that would cause movement of the hip, all right? And so the gluteus maximus is going to laterally rotate the hip. So you can kind of see that. If it contracts, it's going to kind of rotate that hip laterally. And it's also going to extend the hip. So it'll pull it backwards, all right, that leg backwards, causing hip extension. Okay. So then if we hide this muscle, all right, we have our gluteus medius here. Okay. And so the gluteus medius, we'll isolate it, right, goes kind of to the lateral aspect of the femur, right, from the hip. And so that is going to adduct the hip, all right? So pull it away from midline, adduct the hip. That's the gluteus medius. Okay. Good. So now let's look at our hamstrings. All right. So these are the muscles of the back of the thigh. All right. So with our hamstrings, all right, we'll start here with our biceps femoris. And so the biceps femoris is one of our hamstrings. We also have the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. All right. So the tendinosus, if you can kind of see here, is on top of this membranosus here that's underneath it. Okay, so I always remember semitendinosus has a T in it, so it's on top, right? That's this muscle. And then the membranosus sits underneath it there. So these three muscles, right, are the hamstring muscles. Okay. All right, so if we look at, let's just do our biceps femoris here, where it attaches. So it's going to attach, all right, to the kind of back of that ischium, all right, and it's going to wrap around the lateral side of the leg. Okay, so it goes all the way down to the fibula. So it spans the hip and the knee joint. All right, so it would produce both movement at the hip and the knee. So it's going to flex the knee, all right, so pulling that tibia kind of backwards, and it is going to extend the hip. Okay, that's pretty much true for all of those three biceps muscles. All right, flex the knee, extend the hip. Okay, and so the lateralmost muscle, this one, the biceps muscle, all right, is located on the lateral side. The other two, right, are a little more medial here. And so if we can isolate this one, right, you can see it attaches to the medial side of that tibia. Okay, woo, there we go. All right. Okay, so these muscles would be antagonistic to our quadriceps muscles, right? So they're going to produce opposite movements to the quadriceps muscles. Okay, so our last muscles for the leg, right, are going to be our calf muscles. Okay, so you have two important calf muscles. They make up the triceps surae, right? On the outside, the big kind of calf muscles that, you know, when you touch your calf that you're touching, those are the gastrocnemius muscles. All right, so you have the gastrocnemius there. If we isolate those just to see where they attach, right? So it's the distal part of the femur all the way down to your calcaneus, right? Your heel bone. Okay, so that's the triceps, or sorry, the gastrocnemius, okay? When that contracts, that will flex your knee, and that will also cause you to point your toe, right? That's plantar flexion of your foot because it's going to pull that calcaneus upwards, all right? So causing you to point your toe. Okay, and so then our other portion of the triceps surae just sits underneath that gastrocnemius. So we can see that here, right? That's called the sartorius. Actually, let's just hide this gastrocnemius really quick. There we go. So there's our sartorius underneath. Okay, and so it's going to do essentially the same thing. It works synergistically with the gastrocnemius. Okay, good. All right, so practice those, find them, study where they are and what they do. There's lots and lots of practice questions on your chapter review sheet, so work through those. Likely you will see some of them reappear on your exam for this material because remember, again, you're not going to be labeling a picture with muscles, right? They're going to be conceptual questions like are in your chapter review.